He looked at me, and he saw me, but he pretended not to. They say true love has to be lived out loud to be real, that if it was never spoken, it never existed. But I was a nurse in the war, and he smiled at me like he knew it was the end, and even without a single word, that smile changed everything, because not every love story starts with a kiss. Some begin in silence, in a glance shared by two people who were never meant to meet, and who could never forget each other. I didn't touch him like a woman touches a man. I touched him like someone holding a letter that will never be sent. He was the enemy. There was no sound that day, and that scared me more than any bombing ever did. That thick, heavy silence that settles over everything before the storm. It was the first sign something was coming. The makeshift hospital where I worked stood in a muddy valley of burned trees, tucked between two blind spots on the Pacific map. Our main tent was made of canvas darkened by time and dried blood. Everything there had once been something else before, becoming shelter. The floor still held shards of tile, as if trying to remind us there used to be a house there. Maybe a school, or a church. We never knew. War swallows origins and spits out only what's left. He walked in without a sound. No footsteps, no groans, no labored breathing. He just crossed the space between the lifted flap of canvas and the pale noonday light, brought in by two soldiers who didn't say a word either. It wasn't unusual to receive wounded prisoners, though most didn't survive the journey. Many died before we could even treat them. The ones who made it came in with spasms, trembling, begging. Whether they spoke English or not, desperation is a universal language. But he didn't look desperate. He looked finished. Not like someone surrendering. Like someone who no longer belonged to himself. There was a deep cut on the side of his head, and the dried blood had already mixed with dust, forming a grayish crust. He wore a torn military shirt, with the left shoulder ripped, and beneath it, a faded tattoo I couldn't quite make out. He was thin, almost skeletal, but his hands were steady, hands that didn't match a body so close to collapse. His eyes, though, they were something else entirely. There was something in them I don't have the right words to explain. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was as if he had already seen the end of everything, and was just waiting for the rest to catch up. They told me to clean him. That was always my job, to clean before someone else decided what came next. In war, before any decision, came cleanliness, as if dignity still depended on appearance. I put on gloves, soaked the cloths, picked up the instruments. I did what I knew how to do. But when I stepped closer, he looked at me. Not with a pleading look, not with arrogance either. It was a long, still gaze, like someone studying an old photograph, trying to remember what they once felt about it. And in that moment, just in that one moment, I had the strange feeling that we knew each other from somewhere else, or maybe from another time. He didn't speak, and neither did I, because deep down, there was something sacred about that absence of words. A silent pact between two strangers who somehow knew the world wouldn't be the same after this. I slowly wiped his forehead. The blood came off easily. The skin beneath was lighter, almost fragile, like wet paper. There was an old scar at the base of his jaw. I thought of asking what happened, but language was a canyon between us. So I just took a breath and kept going. As I wiped the side of his neck, he closed his eyes. Not like someone passing out, but like someone choosing to trust. There, between the rough sheets and the faint flapping of the tent in the wind, I felt him offering me something no one else had during that whole war. A moment of silence. That wasn't empty. It was full. Full of a story I would never hear. Full of questions he'd never answer. full of a calm I didn't remember how to feel. I finished the bandages, covered the wound with clean gauze, wrote down his intake number, even though I knew it meant nothing to him. Numbers don't tell stories. They just hide them. One of the soldiers returned to take him to a cot. He didn't resist, didn't look back. But as he stepped through the tent's opening, he turned his face slightly, just enough to capture that moment and store it somewhere only he would know. And right then, in that half motion, a chill ran down my spine, not from fear but from premonition, as if something had been planted that day, and neither of us realized it. In the days that followed, I treated dozens of men. Some screamed, some cried, some died holding my hand. But only with him. There was silence. A different silence. A silence that said more than screams ever could. And every time I walked past the corridor where he lay, my body slowed down, as if every cell in me was trying to hear what even my mind couldn't translate. Time in war is measured differently, not in days or weeks, but in repetitions, in glances exchanged, in cloth soaked again and again, in pain that gets disguised. And in all those repetitions he became a constant. The man who walked in without a word began to fill my pauses, my in-betweens, my silences, and I started writing his name, or what I thought his name was, on little slips of paper I kept inside my pocket Bible, as if giving him a name was the only way I had to protect some piece of him from being erased. I don't know exactly when I began to wait for him, but I know I did, quietly. Like someone checking the clock and pretending they're not in a hurry. Like someone faking normal just to keep from falling apart. And it was in that theater of routine and wounds that I learned what it meant to love without intention. To love without plan. To love without even knowing if it was love. Or just two people surviving the same war. The truth is, there was never time to define anything. There was only time to feel. And even that was already too risky. The badge clipped to my collar read, E.M. Benton. But no one used names out there. In war, names are dangerous. They humanize. And to humanize is to weaken. It was easier to refer to the men as the guy from Cot 3, the burn case in the hallway, the one with the collapsed lung. That's how we protected ourselves. We turned wounded bodies into medical charts because it was safer than admitting each one was someone's son. Or worse, someone's love. But with him, it was different. Because I wanted to know, even knowing I shouldn't. On the third day of treating him, someone dropped a small yellowed card near his cot. It looked like some kind of foreign ID, caked in mud and half-torn. The handwriting was rounded, curved, and the name on it was something I couldn't pronounce. It didn't sound German or Japanese. It was somewhere in between. A name I had never seen before, with accents in strange places and consonants that refused to leave my mouth. But they left my hand. Because when my shift ended, I wrote that name, or what I could make of it, on a loose page from my pocket Bible, as if writing it down connected me to him in some secret way, tucked between childhood prayers and verses I no longer believed. I told no one. Didn't try to confirm it with the higher-ups. If that name really belonged to him, it didn't matter. What mattered was that, to me, he stopped being the wounded prisoner in Tent 6. He became a strange word I kept folded in the pocket over my heart, like protecting a spark in the middle of a storm. I watched him more than I should have. Not out of curiosity, but necessity. I wanted to memorize the lines of his face, the restrained movements, the way his fingers kept moving even in sleep, as if he were playing some invisible instrument. It was like learning a new language, but without a teacher, without a dictionary, a language made only of presence and absence. There was one day when he looked at me differently. I was changing the bandages on his ribs, and the gauze had stuck to the new skin. When I peeled it off gently, he flinched. He whispered something I didn't understand, but it sounded like a name. Maybe his mother's. Maybe Payne's. I said softly, "Sorry," like I always did. But this time he didn't look away. He held my gaze like he was recognizing an echo, like he heard something familiar in a foreign land. And then, almost without thinking, I pulled out that folded paper and showed him, pointed to the name. "Is this you?" I asked with my eyes. He smiled, not like he was confirming it, but like he was thanking me. He gave a slight nod, gentle, subtle, like a soul, bowing. That was it. No words. No need for them. That was enough. Because in that moment, what was between us wasn't just a name. It was the mutual recognition that we were more than the roles we'd been assigned. He was the enemy. I was the nurse. But between those two titles, something lived. Something warm. Quiet. A truce no one else knew existed. I began to repeat that name in my head, trying to imagine how he might say it. I found myself writing variations of it on scraps of paper, testing out phonetics on my tongue, as if each try brought me a little closer to his truth. Sometimes I felt ridiculous, a woman trying to learn a foreign name in the middle of a war built on forgetting. But still, I kept going, because it was the only piece of him I could keep. One morning, between one patient and the next, I noticed he was watching me from afar. Not staring, just gently, like someone observing a bird perched too close, knowing any sudden move might scare it off. I pretended not to notice, but my heart tightened, like it wanted to leap out of my chest just to make sure he was still there. And it was that day I started writing letters. Letters I never sent. Letters for no one. Letters for him. Or maybe for myself. I wrote about the unbearable afternoon heat, the smell of medicine, the weight of silence after a shift. I wrote about him, but never named him. I called him the one who looks slowly, or the one who knows where pain lives. Part of me knew I was crossing a line, but another part, older, quieter, told me this was the only real thing I had left. Because in that windowless hospital, where the cries of the wounded drowned out any prayer, writing was the only way I could remember I was still human. I never learned what that name meant, or where it came from, but I began to associate it with the sound of rain on canvas, the scent of his skin after dressing his wounds, the way he snapped his fingers when the morphine was late. It was a name that didn't belong to me, but somehow it lived inside me. And that was all I needed. Because deep down, loving during war means this: holding on to what you don't understand, keeping what you can't say, protecting what you have no right to possess. If he knew I was writing about him, maybe he would have pulled away, or maybe he would have smiled again. I'll never know, because war doesn't give us answers. It only offers fragments. And in that time of stitching and amputation, that unpronounceable name became my greatest secret. A secret that now lives between the yellowed pages of a Bible no one opens anymore. And still, it beats. Sometimes I wonder if love begins in noise or in silence. Most people believe it's born in surprise, in heat, in clumsy steps. But for me, it happened between gauze pads and quiet breaths, between one dressing and the next, between his silence and mine. No one teaches you how to fall in love without speaking. But that's exactly what happened. No warning, no plan, no permission. A feeling that didn't need a name, because no name could hold it. It was just a presence that grew in the spaces between things, in the empty moments, in the small gestures. The routine there was merciless. Men came and went like waves, dragging pieces of our souls with them. Each bed had its own urgency, its own absence. The smells mixed together, dried blood, iodine, sweat, fear. And amid all of that, there was him, lying still most of the time, but always alert. His eyes followed me like someone listening to a melody, and there were days when a single glance was enough for me to know exactly what to do, as if our bodies had already learned how to speak, while our minds were still catching up. He never spoke, and I never pushed, but there was communication, the purest and most mysterious I've ever known. When I changed the bandage on his leg, he'd move his fingers in slow circles. When I filled the syringe with penicillin, he'd take a deeper breath. A system of signals no one else noticed, and I began to store those signals like unwritten letters. At night, before trying to sleep, if there was still time to close my eyes, I'd replay every movement, every micro-expression, like replaying the scene of a dream you can't bear to forget. One day, the heat was especially brutal. The canvas walls felt like they were boiling, and even the water from my canteen tasted like hot metal. I was exhausted, my hands shaking from so much pressure and stitching. When I walked up to his bed, I nearly dropped the tray of instruments. And that's when he reached out, slowly but surely, and wrapped his hand around my wrist. For a second, everything stopped. Time, the noise around us, even my heartbeat hesitated. His eyes were locked onto mine, and his touch was light but steady. Like he was saying, "I see you're wounded too." He didn't say it, but I heard it. I exhaled slowly through my mouth, set the tray down on the stool, and I sat beside him. For the first time, I sat and stayed, not out of duty, not out of protocol, just because I wanted to. We stayed like that for a few minutes, my wrist still in his hand, his head resting on the fold of that flat, military pillow. The world kept moving, but we stayed there, in a kind of time that doesn't exist anymore. The silence wrapped around us like a blanket. And in that silence was born a trust that no language could ever reach. After that, everything changed. No one else noticed, but I did. We developed this kind of invisible schedule. Anytime I could choose the order of patience, I left him for last. Like saving dessert for the end. Like leaving the best part on the edge of the plate, just to enjoy it slower. And in those few extra minutes, I allowed myself to simply exist. Without hurry, without the emotional uniform. Just as Eloise. Not the nurse, not the American. Just a woman sitting beside a man who, even dressed as the enemy, reminded her what it felt like to be human. I started bringing him small, hidden gestures. A piece of warm bread, a clean handkerchief folded with care, an extra button sewn on the cuff of his sleeve. Nothing that would draw attention, but everything that quietly said, "You matter." It was a war, but between our silences, we created a space where no one screamed. A place where no one died. Not for a few minutes, at least. And my dear, you have to have lived through war to understand the value of a single minute without death. Once a new nurse asked me why I took so long at that bed. I made up something about a stubborn infection. Said the stitches were delicate, that healing was slow. She didn't question it. And I kept playing my silent theater, because protecting that time with him was my small rebellion, my intimate insubordination. The proof that even there it was still possible to choose affection. He never tried to escape, never asked for anything, never showed any intention beyond simply being. And being was everything. That's when I learned that love can be born from restraint, too. Not from touch, but from waiting. Not from kisses, but from the gaze that lingers. I started to understand what my grandmother meant when she said the truest feelings are the ones that don't show off. They're like roots. They grow in silence and hold everything up. To this day, I remember the texture of his skin through my gloves, the shift in his breathing when I cleaned the older wounds, the way his eyes closed. Not from pain, but from surrender. Sometimes I wonder if he wrote about me, too, if he mentally kept my gestures the way I did his. But I'll never know, because the silence that connected us was the same one that kept us apart, a thread stretched between two worlds that could never meet. I didn't love him like in the movies. There were no promises, no vows, no stolen kisses in the middle of explosions. I loved him in the space between one dressing and the next, in the time left over when chaos took a breath, in the gaze that rested when all you wanted was not to disappear. It was a love that didn't ask for room. It simply settled where it could, and it fit inside me. It's strange how we remember certain days, as if time paused just to preserve the exact moment when our hearts skipped out of rhythm. For me, that day was the day of the water. I don't know if it was a Tuesday or a Saturday. War doesn't make room for calendars. But I remember the heat was unbearable, the kind that clings to your bones and seeps through your clothes like a fever. I was wearing the same old sweater, even with damp skin, because it gave me some sense of consistency amid the chaos. He was lying there, as always, eyes half closed, and the dressing on his thigh needed changing. I went to grab the tray of instruments with that automatic care that only repetition brings. But for some reason, the corner of the table holding the metal jug was crooked, and as I turned, I tripped over my own foot. The sound of spilled water hit the floor sharp and loud against the quiet of the infirmary, and all I could do was curse. Not a polite gasp, a real curse. One of those we save for when the world feels like it's mocking our strength. And it was in that exact moment, with water running across the floor, the sheets soaked and the rag stained, that he laughed, really laughed. It wasn't loud, not mocking. It was light, short, but so human that it shattered every written and unwritten rule of that place. I froze. I looked at him like you look at a child speaking for the first time. His eyes were more open than ever. And that sound, the sound of his laugh, was like a brand new language opening just for me. A sound that didn't belong in that space, that didn't match the other noises of war, that felt completely out of place. And that's exactly why it undid me. It made me laugh, too. Not out loud, not exaggerated, but with my whole body, with my gaze, with my skin. It was the first time I felt we were alive at the same time, in the same rhythm. And in that reality, that was a miracle. I grabbed a dry cloth and, still laughing, crouched down to clean the floor. He followed me with his eyes, like he was taking in something precious. That's when I noticed. The lines in his face had softened, his furrowed brow had eased, his lips, always tight, now curved gently. And I realized that smile was different from the ones we saw on recovering patients. It wasn't relief from pain. It was something else. A silent thank you. A wordless recognition. Like he was saying, "You gave me a moment of humanity. Thank you." I continued the treatment, cleaned the wound, changed the dressing with extra care. But something had changed. It was like that brief exchange of laughter had broken through a layer of ice we hadn't even known was there. For the first time, I didn't feel like an intruder on his body. I felt allowed to be there, fully present, whole. When I finished, instead of turning his face away like he usually did, he held my gaze. For a few more seconds. Long ones, weighty ones, beautiful. That night I wrote about it in the notebook I kept hidden inside my suitcase lining. I wrote, "Today he laughed. He laughed at me, laughed with me, laughed at the world, And for a moment he was just a man, and I was just a woman. There was no war between us, just the sound of water falling, and the relief of laughing without fear. I folded the page carefully, like it was too fragile to survive time, and placed it with the others. But that one was gold. The days that followed felt like walking on glass. Every step I took toward him came laced with expectation and fear. Would he laugh again? Was it just a one-time slip? But he never laughed quite like that again. There were other smiles, yes, small, restrained ones. But that one, the one from the water day, was the only one that made me feel like I existed in the same moment as him. Breathing the same air, without guilt. Sharing the war, with lightness. I replayed that laugh in my mind like someone listening to a rare record. On the days when exhaustion pressed in, when blood wouldn't stop pouring from other bodies, I clung to that memory. It was like a secret song only I could hear. And it gave me breath. It gave me purpose. It gave me meaning. No one around understood why I seemed more alive when treating him. But that was it. I knew he carried something inside him that even the war hadn't destroyed. Laughter. And that was enough for me. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with pretty words or grand gestures. Sometimes it slips in with spilled water on the floor. It shows itself in the laugh that wasn't supposed to happen, in the stumble that becomes connection, in the unexpected sound that slices through the air and ties you back to life. I didn't plan to love that man. I didn't choose that moment. But it was there, in the middle of metal trays and wet linens, that my heart decided he wasn't the enemy anymore. He was just a man. A man who, for one fleeting instant, truly saw me. And maybe that's why, when I saw him again years later in that grocery store, the only thing I longed for was that smile. That exact one. The one that only existed between the water and the silence. But he didn't smile. He looked. And he looked away. And that gesture hurt more than all the battlefields I ever crossed. But that is a story for another time. In war, what isn't recorded never existed. Paper mattered more than people. A name left off the list meant forgetting. A misplaced file could mean the difference between a posthumous medal and a body left in the weeds. I knew that. We all did. That's why, when he disappeared from my routine, from his cot, from my line of sight, from my schedule, and that unpronounceable name vanished from the medical drafts, I understood. I understood the way one recognizes an emptiness inside the chest even before it has a name. It was on a cloudy morning, when the generator's groaning sounded like metal, dragging grief, that I noticed his bed was empty. The blanket was folded in a strange way, like someone had yanked it hastily. The IV bag still hung there, a lone droplet sliding down its side. The mattress held the imprint of his body. And the silence. That silence wasn't ours anymore. It was different. A silence that screamed something had shifted without asking for my permission. I asked the triage sergeant, voice low and professional, "Where did the patient from Tent 6 go?" He replied flatly, "Transferred," and went back to scribbling on his clipboard, as if that word closed any story. "Transferred where?" I asked 2 nurses, a doctor, a cook. No one knew, or no one would say. One of them gave me a look that stayed with me for days. A warning look, the kind that says, "You're asking too many questions." And that's when I learned that some disappearances aren't accidents. They're protocol, they're orders, strategies to erase what shouldn't exist within the war. A prisoner with no value, even if recovered, was no longer needed, no longer a priority. He was weight, but he wasn't just that. Not to me. His name stayed with me, folded between the pages of my pocket Bible, and now stitched in little variations onto a piece of cloth I sewed into the inside of my uniform. Maybe a foolish gesture, but it was my way of ensuring he existed, at least in me, somewhere, even if the world said otherwise. I spent days watching the evacuation trucks, studied each covered face, each body strapped to a stretcher, each hurried soldier. I looked for signs, a scar, a tilt of the head, a confirmation. But I never saw anything. It was during that time that I went back to writing letters. Dozens of them, all without addresses, no stamps. They always started the same. "Are you still alive?" And ended with, "I dreamed of your smile again." I wrote during night shifts, when the others were sleeping, and only the hum of fans and the delirious moans of the wounded filled the air. The lamplight trembled over the paper, and the words came slowly, like they were afraid of being caught. One of them I wrote like this: "It rained inside the infirmary today. New leak. But I remembered your laugh from the water day. It sounded almost the same. But as time passed, that dirty, stagnant wartime that never moves forward but never quite stops either, his absence became routine. More patients came, more wounds, more screams, more dead. And I folded his memory like a damp letter. Something you don't throw away but don't put on display either. A secret you don't touch for fear it will unravel. People asked if I was tired. I said yes. But it wasn't my body. It was my chest, the part where he had fit. Now just empty. No one ever mentioned his name again. And I learned not to say it, not even in my mind, as if invoking it might summon punishment. Because in war's logic, clinging to someone from the other side was betrayal, even if that someone had no side anymore. Even if he was just a man who made me laugh in the middle of death. Even if he had become my pause, my breath of humanity, my antidote to despair. When I finally returned home, years later, I brought back a small suitcase and a creased Bible. Inside it, between psalms and hymns, the pages still held crooked handwriting, the folded name, the phrases without translation. I never showed them to anyone, and for a long time I believed he had died. Maybe executed in a camp, maybe buried in a mass grave, maybe erased by the same silence that had once bound us. The thought consumed me, and comforted me too. Because if he was dead, then he hadn't forgotten me. He'd just left first. But fate, that unkind trickster who loves to challenge an old woman's certainty, had another answer in store. And I wasn't ready. Because decades later, turning a random corner in Seattle somewhere between groceries and paper bags, I saw a man with that same posture, that same walk, that same profile of someone carrying a life they never told anyone about. And when he turned his face, and I saw the scar on his eyebrow, I knew instantly. He survived. The whole world thought he hadn't. Even I didn't. But he survived. And that changed everything. And nothing. Because surviving, my girl, doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means the opposite. It means turning your face, pretending it never happened, burying love in a single gesture, silencing the past with the cruelest silence of all. Denial. But that's a story for later. I didn't go out much. Ever since I came back from the war, I'd settled into a quiet routine. Wake up early, fold the blanket like we used to in the Pacific tents, make black coffee without sugar, listen to the news only halfway through, then lose myself in old books, dried plants, and notebooks no one else reads. The city had grown without me. Seattle now stretches upward with buildings that cut the sky I used to see whole from my window. The sidewalks changed. The shops changed. Only my body, it seems, stayed behind in time. It was by chance that I went out that morning. The lavender on the porch had rotted from the last rain, so I decided to buy a new plant at the old downtown market, the one where the vendors still write prices on paper with blue pens, where the smell of cinnamon mixes with vinegar. I liked that place because it felt forgotten, like me. I walked in slowly, canvas bag on my shoulder, steps careful like someone carrying memories in their joints. I picked out apples, a bag of flour, and made my way to the flower section. That's when I looked to the side. He was standing with his back to me, tall, broad shoulders, the same way of moving, like he carried something too heavy to name. A small child ran between his legs, laughing. He held a white rose in his right hand and bent down to speak to a blonde woman with short hair. It was a simple scene. Familiar. Too American. But there was something on his neck, a subtle shift, a crease I knew better than my own reflection. And then, as if the universe couldn't resist one more test, he turned. There was no warning, no let-up, just his face, right in front of mine. The same face, older, yes, with the deep lines time never forgives. But the eyes? Oh, the eyes. They were exactly the same. Dark green, hooded, carrying the same look he had when he watched me spill the water in the infirmary. And the scar, small, angled just over his left eyebrow, was still there. The same, unchanged. As if time had erased everything but that one mark. For a second, the world stopped. I don't mean in the poetic way people describe reunions. I mean it really stopped. My body froze. My breath halted. My memory rose up like a sleeping beast, and everything, absolutely everything, came back. The heat of the tent, the smell of medicine, the sound of canvas flapping, his laughter, his light touch on my wrist, the absence on the empty cot. I was back in that time in the blink of an eye. But he was still there, present, solid, real. He saw me. I know he did. His eyes passed over me like they hesitated, like they almost admitted they knew. For a fraction of a second, we looked at each other, and there, in that glance, a whole lifetime fit. But then he did the unthinkable. He lowered his gaze, turned slowly, took the woman's hand, and walked away, like someone choosing not to remember, like someone erasing a whole history with one simple gesture, like someone refusing the past just to protect the life they've built. I stayed there, frozen, standing beside the hydrangeas, my hand still on the apple, as if my body didn't know what to do without his eyes on me. The girl at the register asked if I needed help. I said no, but I did. My heart was trembling in a way it hadn't in years, not from love, but from pain. The pain of being invisible to someone who once saw all of you. The pain of having once been someone's refuge, and now not even a flicker in their memory. I walked home slowly, each step unraveling a thread of memory. I saw it all again. The spilled water, the smile, the way his breath slowed when I cleaned his wounds, the letters I wrote, the name I'd stitched into my uniform lining, the Bible page still holding that half-written name. Everything. I came home like someone gathering the pieces of something that had already been broken, but now turned to dust. And for the first time in many years, I cried. Not like widows cry, not like mothers who bury their sons. I cried like someone mourning what they were never allowed to have. Like someone realizing that what they guarded so carefully has no place in the other person's world. I cried for what we were, for what we might have been, and most of all, for what we chose not to be. He was alive, and that should have brought me joy, but it shattered me, because he chose to live without remembering me. And that choice, that denial, hurt more than if I'd confirmed his death. because the dead leave us with longing, but the living who deny us leave us hollow. And still, I kept that moment, like I kept all the others, because even without recognition, even without a nod, even without a single word, I saw him, and that, for me, was truth enough. The war took many things from me, but not my memory, and as long as I remember that face, that scar, and that brief hesitation, he will still exist. He was there, standing between white roses and the life he built, and even if he never looks at me again, I saw the proof that he survived. And that is what makes it all the harder. He saw me, and he looked away. It's hard to write that out in full. Harder still was accepting it with every part of my body. I who once stitched open wounds, who buried boys with names sewn into their shirt collars, who scrubbed blood from under my nails for months. I never learned how to tend to this kind of pain. The invisible kind. The kind that comes from being erased from the eyes that once saved you from the slowest kind of death, the death of existing without being seen. That glance away was graceful, almost elegant, done with the cruel precision of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. There was no rush, no surprise, just the silent decision not to let his eyes rest on me for more than a second, as if to say without saying, I recognize you, but I can't. That whole sentence was there, in the lashes that didn't lift, in the head that turned at just the right moment, in the hand that tightened around the blonde woman's fingers. And that kind of message, my dear, hurts more than any letter returned unopened. I stood still for a long time, the shopping bag limp in my hand, and the flowers forgotten on the floor. The world kept spinning around me, the clatter of carts, the cashier's loud voices, the beep of barcodes, the laughter of a child with no idea what was happening, just 3 steps away. But inside me, everything froze, still, like time didn't stop because of the shock of the reunion, but because of the refusal within it. The war, again, inside my chest, only now, without a uniform. I walked slowly out of the market, crossed the street like someone carrying shattered glass in their pockets, sat on the bench at the bus stop, not even sure what line came through there. And for the first time in a very long time, I wanted to disappear, not die. Just disappear, like he had, like he chose to do with me. Because, my darling, when someone who once knew your most intimate silence chooses to go silent in front of your presence, there's almost nothing left of you. I spent the rest of the day curled up in the back room, the one where the floorboards groaned louder than my knees, and the heavy curtains barely let in the light. I didn't eat, didn't open the mail, didn't turn on the radio. I just sat in the armchair and stared at nothing, because sometimes nothing is the only place that still fits us. I tried to convince myself maybe he hadn't recognized me, that the age, the gray hair, the wrinkles, maybe they'd changed me too much. But it was a lie. I saw it in his eyes. I saw the second he saw me, and the second after, when he chose not to. That night I got up slowly, took the old Bible from the closet and opened to the page where his name, or the sound I had left of it, was still tucked away. The letters were faded now, like a memory washed by time's rain. But they were still there, and there, alone in the quiet of my house, I cried. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in movies, but the kind that comes from the throat, that shakes in your fingers, that scrapes your memory raw. I cried for me. I cried for him. I cried for both of us, and for everything that never happened out loud, but lived inside me like it had always been spoken. The next day I tried going back to the market. I waited at the same time, walked the same aisles, pretended to search for the same apples. But he wasn't there, and he didn't come back in the days that followed. As if the universe had decided that one moment, that small, silent tragedy, was enough. As if nothing more was needed to make me relive all the wars I'd fought inside. Sometimes I think life does that. Gives you just 1 second to remind you that pain never really leaves. It only sleeps. In the days that came after, I started talking to him again. Not out loud, but inside, while watering the plants, sewing dish towels, pouring morning coffee. I told him everything his eyes refused to say. I said, yes, I still remember your scent after the morphine. I said, yes, I still write letters to you, even without an address. I said, yes, you were the only silence I ever wanted to keep. But he chose to leave, and he chose to forget. And that kind of choice, my dear, can't be undone with words. I know, I've tried. But still something inside me refuses to die. Something stays. Because when someone sees all of you in a time when everything was being lost, you don't forget. Even if they do, even if they try, even if they pretend. Some say a love like that isn't worth it, that what goes unlived, unnamed, unspoken, has no value. But I disagree, because what I carry here in my chest isn't made up. It's not fantasy. It's a structure, built from memories, from small gestures, from changed dressings, from glances held a second longer than they should have been, and that alone is a story worth remembering, even if he prefers to forget. Maybe one day he'll return to that market. Maybe he'll see me again and make a different gesture. Maybe he won't. But what he doesn't know, what he'll never know, is that the simple act of seeing me and choosing to look away was the cruelest moment I've ever lived outside of war. Because in that instant, more than a nurse, more than a woman, more than a memory, I was invisible. And that, my daughter, is the deepest wound someone can leave behind. Sometimes I wonder if he ever dreams of me. If on some quiet night, lying beside the wife he chose, his body tired and his eyes lost in the ceiling, he hears my muffled laughter behind the canvas walls of that tent, or feels the touch of my hands damp with water and iodine on his fevered skin. I wonder if, while shaving in the morning, the blade glides over that old scar, and even without meaning to, he remembers the girl in the blue sweater with the anchor brooch, who dressed his wounds like she was stitching silence. But if he dreams of me, he doesn't say. Not to me, not to anyone. And I've learned to honor that invisible pact, because what we had, though never spoken aloud, never stopped being real. It was built from absence, from gesture, from pauses. It was like a handkerchief hidden in a pocket, like a letter written and never sent, like a name half-spoken that lives in the memory by its sound, not its meaning. It was something that only exists between two people who lived the impossible together, and silently chose never to speak of it. Yes, my daughter. There are loves like that. Loves that survive not for what they were, but for what they never dared to be. What we shared was a secret held by two, locked behind doors that only open from the inside. He chose silence, and so did I. Not out of fear, but because we knew the world had no room for a war story that bloomed in the mud, between enemies, without witnesses or blessing. I went back to that market so many times in the months that followed. I never saw him again, but I saw traces. A sprig of mint overturned in a tray, the corner of a grocery list on the ground, the lilt of an accent too soft to be from here. And inside me, a part still waited. Not for reunion, just for confirmation. For some small sign that I hadn't just been a wartime hallucination. That somewhere in his memory, He still carried the thread that once bound us. But no, there was never a letter, never a note, just the echo of a glance that said, "Yes, I saw you, but now I'm someone else, and you must remain only a memory." I understood, and I kept being the woman he met in a war with no shared language, the one who made him smile when everything was bleeding, the one who wrote his name between psalms, the one who didn't shout, didn't demand, didn't expose. I just kept, like something precious and fragile that can't survive the sun. And maybe that was our final agreement, to love in silence so the love wouldn't die through speech. There's a kind of silence that wounds, my dear, but there's another that cradles, that shields, that holds. Ours was that kind, the silence that says, "I remember," without needing a single word. That's why, when the neighbors asked why I never married, I smiled gently and said, "I had someone." It was the truth, not one they'd understand, but one my heart knew. There were nights I talked to him in my mind, repeated his name or the version I had rebuilt the best I could. I said all the things I never said, told him about my day, the loneliness, the letters I tore up. I said, "You still live here," and I'd touch my chest, then cry a little and fall asleep, not from sadness, but from acceptance, because accepting someone's silence is sometimes the only dignified way to keep their memory alive. There was never an end between us, not even a beginning, really, just this endless middle, this infinite pause between one dressing and one smile, between the absence of his body and the presence of his soul. And that kind of love, no one understands, but it exists. I know it does, because it still pulses in me every time I trace the scar he left on my memory, the one that never healed. Some days I think about writing it all down in a real letter, addressing it to his name, sending it without a return address. But every time I pick up paper and pen, my hands tremble, because part of me still believes that the secret only survives if it stays quiet. It's like a desert flower. It needs silence to bloom. It needs absence to stay pure. Spoken aloud, our story would lose its grace. It would become just another forbidden love, just another scandal. But kept here, folded between the years and the sweat of remembrance, it remains sacred, and he knows, even without saying it, even without looking again, even with a wife at his side and a life built in another language. He knows, and I do too. And that shared knowing, that secret kept by two, is all I have left, and all I ever needed. My dear, I write this letter like tracing a scar on paper, not to ask for anything, not to demand answers, just to finally let out what's been stuck for so long, between my ribs, in the folds of time, inside the part of me I never managed to show anyone. Maybe you'll never read it. Maybe it'll never reach you. Maybe it'll end up in a drawer, or in the fire, or swept away by the wind. But today I need to write. Not really for you, but for the part of me that still holds you gently, like someone protecting the last lit match on a stormy night. I saw you, at the market, between flowers and bags. And you saw me too. Don't try to deny it. I recognized you before I even saw the scar. I knew you by the way your shoulders moved, by the way you held that white rose like it was too fragile for this world. I saw the moment your eyes landed on mine. I saw the quiet jolt, the silent recognition, the hesitation that lasted longer than it should have, even if it looked like nothing. And I saw, with more pain than I thought possible, the exact moment you chose not to see me. The moment you turned your head and held another hand, hers. And I understood it, everything, without a single word. But today I need to tell you that I made a choice too. I chose not to call you, not to run after you, not to say your name, or the sound of it that still lives in my memory. I chose to respect the silence that once held us together, the same silence that saved us when everything around us only knew how to kill. Because love that lives in what is left unsaid is sometimes deeper than the kind that screams. And what we had, even though it never had a name, was love. Not the kind you write in cards or seal with kisses, but the kind that crosses wars without being seen, the kind that survives even when it isn't acknowledged. Do you remember the water day? I tripped, dropped everything. I was furious with myself, but you laughed. And in that laugh, for the first time in months, I heard a piece of myself that still believed in life. You made me laugh too. And there, among soaked towels and crooked trays, something was born. Something I spent the rest of the war trying to hide from myself. And after, trying to protect. I kept your name, written wrong, stitched into my uniform, hidden in the pages of my old Bible. I prayed for you, not with the words the priests used, but with my heart. I asked that you live, that you be spared, that you find peace, even if it meant far away from me. And when you disappeared from that cot, I felt your absence like a silent gunshot in the chest. I thought you had died, thought they had erased you, and in some ways, they had. Erased you from the records, from the files, but never from me. You stayed alive in the letters I never wrote, in the smell of clean cloth, in the sound of the canvas flapping in the wind, in the care I gave to every soldier after you. Because even if I never said it, in every gesture I was still looking for your face. And when I came home, I brought you with me, in my eyes, in my memory, in the way I could never truly fall in love again, because no one ever saw me the way you did, and no one ever stayed silent the way you did, with such tenderness. Sometimes I wondered if I made it all up, if it was just a delusion, a fantasy dreamt up by an exhausted young nurse. But then I'd remember your eyes, your hand holding my wrist, the way your fingers moved when I changed your dressings. And no, it wasn't made up. It was real, so real it held me up for more than 40 years. Seeing you at the market made me bleed inside, but it also brought peace, because you were alive, you survived, you built something, maybe a house, a family, a new name. And I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm just tired of carrying all this alone, and that's why I'm writing. Not so you'll look at me again, but so I can finally look at myself and see the woman I was with you, strong, quiet, whole. The war gave us an impossible time. It tore us from the regular paths of life and threw us into each other's arms like two strangers destined not to stay. But for a few days, a few weeks, we were truth. And even if now we're just two old people pretending not to know each other, I carry that with dignity. You were my secret, and I was yours. And maybe, in the end, that was the only way love could exist in a world that insisted on dividing everything into right and wrong. I don't want anything from you. Not a glance, not a letter, not an apology. I just wanted you to know I remember, and that even in silence. You still live here, in the folded pages. In the afternoons when the sun hits the stained glass in my living room, and I feel the heat of the field again. You still live in me, and even if you never remember my name again, I will always remember your laugh. Goodbye. With everything I kept, Eloise. I waited a few days before going back to the market. I needed to give time to my hands, still trembling when they touched the name I kept inside. Time for my eyes, still chasing what my heart already knew it wouldn't find again. But more than anything, I needed to give space to silence. That thick, sacred silence that exists between an unspoken goodbye and a wordless acceptance. It was a gray Tuesday, the kind of day that drags like a wet veil across your shoulders. I left the house with a handkerchief in my pocket. Not just any handkerchief. That one. The one made of delicate fabric I embroidered years ago with his name. Or rather, the sound of him I held onto. Crooked letters, nearly faded, like they'd been written more with the heart than with the hand. I ran my fingers across the cloth before leaving. It was my last letter, my final offering. And this time, it wouldn't stay hidden in a drawer. I would leave it for fate to see. I entered the market like someone crossing a minefield of memories. The shelves were all in the same place, the flower section too. I walked slowly, pretending to pick apples, but scanning the space around me. I knew he wouldn't be there. I didn't feel his presence, not that morning. But there was something, a residue. A trace of time settled in the corners of memory. That's when I saw her. The woman. The one who'd been with him on the day of the glance. She was there, alone, in a blue coat, holding a wicker basket, selecting white roses with a kind of calm that ached in my bones. She didn't recognize me. She didn't have to. I recognized her. For both of us. I watched how she handled each flower with slender fingers, testing the firmness of the stems, the freshness of the petals. That woman had no idea who I was. She couldn't have known the war story folded into the bones of the older woman not 2 aisles away. But that was part of the painful beauty of life. Not everyone needs to know. Some secrets are meant only for the eyes of chance. I waited until she stepped away, answering a florist's call toward the back room. That's when I moved. Quickly, but without fuss. I pulled the handkerchief from my pocket, folded it neatly in thirds, and tucked it among the white roses. On top, I placed a piece of brown paper with a single sentence, written in the shaky hand that time allowed me. He smiled at me like he knew it was the end. That was all. Nothing more, no names, no explanations. Just the whispered memory of a moment that had lived hidden for more than half a century. Then I turned, heart racing, and left without looking back. The ground seemed to slip beneath my feet, just like that morning in the infirmary. But this time, it wasn't water. It was time. It was weight. It was closure. I walked to the bus stop with lighter steps, as if leaving that handkerchief behind had finally removed something I'd been carrying for years. And maybe it had. Not the pain, but the secret. And with it, the loneliness that comes from holding it alone. I sat on the wooden bench, opened the bag of apples I didn't even remember choosing, and just breathed. I listened to the noise of the city the way you listen to the soundtrack of an old film. A film that, now, could finally end. Back home, I went straight to the living room. The light filtered through the stained glass in soft afternoon colors, casting patches of blue and green across the rug. The wall clock marked some random hour, but to me, it was the first hour of the rest of my story. I sat in the armchair, took off my sweater slowly, and looked down at my hands. The same hands that once held broken bodies, cleaned wounds, embroidered forbidden names in starless nights. The same hands now rested gently on my lap, as if they had completed a silent mission. I didn't know if he'd ever see the handkerchief. Maybe he would. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe his wife would keep it, not understanding. Maybe she'd throw it away. Maybe forget it on the table. But that no longer belonged to me. What belonged to me was the gesture, the offering, the ending of a silence filled with love, fear, respect, and truth. Because sometimes my daughter, the most dignified way to say, "I loved you," is not to say it at all. It's to leave a sign, a breath, a trace. And that afternoon, when the rain began tapping softly on the stained glass, I understood that even without a happy ending, this was my love story, a war story, a heartbreaking story, a story no one ever wrote down, but that lived inside me like a prayer, a knot, a flame. He smiled at me, and I live my whole life inside that smile. Now, I can rest. Have you ever loved in silence, my daughter? Not the kind of silence born from fear, but the other kind. The kind that comes from knowing that not all love needs to be spoken out loud to be true. The kind that lives between the lines of what was never said, but was felt so fully, it echoes through decades beneath the skin. I lived a story like that, a war story, a love story, a story of silence, a love born between bandages and dust that first smiled between wet linens and survived even after averted eyes marked the end without a single word. For a long time I thought I needed to hide it all, like it was a mistake, like it was too fragile for the world. But today I know that keeping something safe is also a way of loving it, that honoring what couldn't be is still a form of respect. He never called me by name, and I never truly knew how to say his. But between us there was something stronger than any word. There was presence, there was care, there was a tenderness that even war couldn't destroy. And that was already everything. If you stayed with me until now, thank you. Thank you for listening with your heart to what so many would ignore in a hurry. You, who maybe also lived a love with no stage, no ending, but still alive as memory. Know this, there's beauty in that. There's courage in those who love in silence. There's strength in those who keep without asking. There's poetry in stories that don't shout, but live on in the quietest folds of the soul. Today I look through the window and see the rain sliding down the stained glass, like the letters I never sent. Each drop is a memory. Each trail of water carries a piece of who I was, of who we were. And it's okay. Some stories are made for that, for slipping slowly, for sinking deep without noise, for existing where no one else can see. If this story touched something inside you, I ask gently, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you can, leave a comment. Share whether you've lived something that never had a name. Share it with someone who needs to know that silence can also be home. That love, even without applause, can be whole. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, you'll finally let go of the handkerchief folded in your own chest pocket. With affection, Eloise. But on the makeshift cot of a hospital ship, between blood, fever, and bandages, he was the only one who truly saw me. And when I saw him again, decades later, on the other side of life, on the other side of history, he looked away, and I understood. Not every reunion heals. Some just confirm that the deepest kind of love is the one no one ever believes really happened. Maybe you've also kept someone hidden inside you, someone you never had the courage to say out loud. Maybe you've lived through an impossible love that only survives in torn-up letters or forgotten handkerchiefs. If you're still here, I invite you to listen to my story, because what I have to share doesn't fit inside a romance novel, or a film, or a war diary. It fits only in the place where it's always lived, the hidden fold of a heart that learned to love, in the very moment when everything else around it was learning how to die. My name is Eloise Marjorie Benton, and I'm 85 years old. Well lived, or maybe just survived, as I've learned to say. I live alone in an old Victorian house in Seattle, with furniture that creaks more than I do, and stained glass windows where the rain taps like it's trying to share secrets no one dares to hear. Here every object holds a memory. The anchor brooch pinned to my sweater, the one I'm wearing right now, carries more than just symbolism. It carries silence. It carries absence. It carries him. During the Second World War, I served as a nurse in an advanced field post in the Pacific. I wasn't a hero, just a pair of hands trying to hold on to men slipping through the fingers of life. But one day, between the wounded and the moaning, he arrived. A soldier who didn't speak our language, who didn't wear our uniform, but who gave me back, with a single glance, the feeling of being alive in a world that only knew how to talk about death. Caring for him was like stitching my own heart back together, and losing him was learning that some war stories don't end in gunfire. They end in absence. Decades later, I saw that same face again in the aisle of a grocery store. The same walk, the same silence, the same scar across his face. He saw me, stopped, breathed, and then looked away, as if he'd never known me, as if that laughter between bandages never happened, as if I had never happened. Today, my dear, I want to tell you that story. A story full of war, full of silence, full of love. I just ask that you sit with me a little while. Pull your chair close to the heater, listen to the rain, and let me open the trunk I've kept locked since 1944. There's no rush. Just bring your heart. And if something in you recognizes any part of what I'm about to say, like this video, subscribe to the channel and stay until the end, because some secrets only a grandmother would tell, and this one is mine.